the information, right? So we're going to be talking about sensory tracts and motor tracts. And these are simply, so the way you want to think about this is simply directions, right? So if I am trying to get you over to that enormous park over by Indiana, right? I could send you several different ways, correct? I could send you east and north at 275, I can send you west on 275, I can send you down and loop around, go through Kentucky, come out the other side, right? I can send you multiple ways. So when you are dealing with paths, all this is how you are going to get this information into the brain or out of the brain. Which parts do you go to, right? It's just direction. So when you're thinking about these pathways, they are simply what freeways are you taking to get into the brain and out of the brain, okay? That's all they are is directions. So, because it is set up that way, I have names of several different tracks, and I have originate here. Where are you starting on your path, right? Where does it cross sides, right? We know that the right side of the brain controls which side of the body? The left, right? You have to cross sides. So are you crossing sides at the level of the spinal cord? Are you crossing sides at the pyramid? Where are you crossing sides? So you have to get to the other side, right? And then I've got innervates, right? Where does it end, right? Is it innervating skeletal muscle? Is it innervating smooth muscle? Is it innervating cardiac muscle, right? So this is giving you directions, right? Where are we going? Sensory pathway, same deal, right? Where does it start? Where does it end? Sensory pathway, what is a sensory pathway? Which way does it go? In, right? So it has to start where? Out, right? It has to start in the periphery, right? Receptors in the skin, you know, right? Outside the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and then it's going to go in, right? So it has originates here, right? Peripheral nervous system would be a good place to start. Where does it cross sides? Where does it end, right? So this is helping you get the directions down, right? It's just providing directions, travel directions to someone, okay? Has a couple of questions, kind of thinking questions, what do you do? And then I've got pictures of pathways that are not labeled, right? So for each of the tracks, you're going to have to figure out which picture it belongs to. You should know, if you know the directions, you should be able to figure out, right, if it's crossing sides here, right, what pathway that is, because you just filled out a table saying where it's crossing sides. Does that make sense, everybody? No? Totally lost. So there are a whole bunch of videos. They are simply my PowerPoint with my voice. You're going to take your PowerPoints, or however you take notes, you're going to take notes on them, right, just like you do in class. You're going to fill out the packet. I will collect the packet on April 3rd, okay? We will go over the packet to make sure that you all are all on the same page, right, and didn't miss anything. I'll review any questions that you have. Is everyone okay with that, right? You will have labs, okay? So you will have labs. There will be a 10-point quiz over exercise 11 on Tuesday of next week, right? Exercise 11 is what we are covering now. Okay, so 8 o'clock lab will run, 11 o'clock lab will run. Instructor Rosenblum will be covering the 8 o'clock. Professor Witham will be covering the 11 o'clock. Okay, so you still have labs. There will be quizzes in labs. How many of you have been looking at that practice PowerPoint, the Jeopardy game for lab? Got a couple? Strongly recommend, right, that you use that to study. So tell me what the quiz is going to look like. Right? Strongly recommend that you use that Jeopardy game to practice. Okay, use it to practice. It tells you the right answers. Okay? So use that to practice. Prepare for the quiz that way.
Is this quiz going to be on model or is it going to be on PowerPoint?
It can be on PowerPoint. So any questions so far? You guys okay? So I will send out a very detailed announcement via Blackboard saying there will not be lecture, there will be lab. For lecture, please review the videos. There's going to be a folder in your Blackboard site that has the videos posted. You can view the videos, take notes just like you do in class, fill out your packet. Are we good? Okay. So what we're going to do today is we're going to finish this PowerPoint. Right? We're going to get through this lecture. Now, do you remember last time we were in the cerebrum, right? splits into two hemispheres. The left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Right? What's the big tract that connects the two hemispheres of the cerebrum? Corpus callosum. What does that look like? You're looking at a model, and a big C here, right? That's connecting our two hemispheres, okay? We talked about the cerebral cortex, right? Where do you find the cerebral cortex? Outside, right? So we're looking at the cortex, got all those wrinkles. The couple millimeter layer on the outside is the cerebral cortex. Is that white or gray matter? Gray. What does gray matter mean?
Cell bodies.
Cell bodies, right? So we've got cell bodies filling that region, okay? All right, so let's switch over. Each hemisphere receives sensory information and sends motor commands to the opposite side of the body, right? Opposite side. Right? So right side of the brain controls muscles on the left side of the body. Sensory information from the left side of the body goes to the right side of the brain, right? Opposite side. Now, hemispheres look identical, right? In lab, you couldn't tell the left from the right other than the way they were oriented, right? But they actually have very different functions. One side is going to deal with language, one side will deal with mathematics, right? So they, even though they look very, very similar, they actually have different functions. We're going to cover that a little bit later. Complex functions, thought, processing of information, cannot typically be assigned to a specific region, but you get indistinct boundaries, right? That function takes place over multiple areas in the brain. Okay. All right, so you remember how we divvied out the brain into the different lobes, right? Frontal, we had the central sulcus, parietal. Okay. What was this region important for? Is this a sensory structure or a motor structure? It's a motor, right? This is our pre-central gyrus. It doesn't have an S. Here is our post-central gyrus. Post has an S. S for sensory. Okay? So motor commands are going to come from this region. Sensory information is going to go here. Okay? Remember how we talked about we're going to send out directions, right? So where would a motor pathway start? Right there. Right? So we said our motor commands are issued from here. So it's good to think directions, right? As we're going through these parts, you're going to be using them later. Okay? So we've got the parietal lobe, we've got the occipital lobe, and we've got the temporal lobe. Okay? All right. Now, in lab, I had several people asking me about, do I need to know this? I can't find a model that looks like this. And it all dealt with the cerebral or basal nuclei. What's a nucleus? Collection of, yeah, it's a DNA. We're talking about in the brain, or in the nervous system. We talked about ganglia, nuclei, tracts, and nerves. Remember those? What's a nerve? A collection of axons in the peripheral nervous. You were all here for this. You're making me sad.
I wasn't here.
You weren't here. Yeah. Everyone but you. Everyone but you, Andrew. All right. So these are a collection of cell bodies. So is this going to be white or gray?
Gray.
Gray. Right. Gray matter. Collection of cell bodies. All right. So these cerebral nuclei are located inside the cerebrum, right? And they're a collection of gray matter, cell bodies, right? We're going to concentrate the cell bodies in these regions. All right? Now, this is really important as far as function goes. These are motor structures. Motor structures. So these are responsible for patterns of movement, rhythms of movement. So you think things that are rhythmic, right? We swung our arms as we walked down the sidewalk, right? And that's a pattern of movement, right? Right? So you could swing your arms. It's not like you think about it, but you do it. Okay? Cerebral nuclei are involved in developing and issuing that pattern, right? Now, this is for movement that has already begun, right? So starting movement doesn't so much involve this, but it's once you're going, all right? So important part, kind of thinking about this, the substantia nigra, through the release of dopamine, inhibits the basal nuclei. Do you remember our inhibitory postsynaptic potential? Right? So we had our, right? This was depolarization of our postsynaptic cell. That was EPSP, right? Closer to threshold, excitatory. Then we had hyperpolarization in our postsynaptic cell. That was inhibitory postsynaptic potential, right? So we're going to inhibit this region, or we're going to inhibit our cerebral nuclei. The substantia nigra is responsible for inhibiting our basal nuclei or cerebral nuclei, right? So what does that mean? What are we going to do to the cerebral nuclei? Are they going to be more likely or less likely to trigger action potentials? Less likely. We're suppressing its activity, okay? So this is going to be important later on. You know anyone that has Parkinson's disease? Parkinson's? It affects the substantia nigra, or it won't work. If it won't work, what happens to the activity of the cerebral nuclei? It goes faster, right? We're going to have action potentials being released, so you're going to have motor activity. And a lot of the symptoms of Parkinson's deal with motor activity, inappropriate motor activity. All right, so our cerebral nuclei collect information from sensory, motor, and integrative areas of the cortex. So they're going to collect sensory information. What do I want to do? Where is the ground, right? That's collecting sensory information, motor information, and then the output is going to travel through the thalamus, you know where that is in the brain because we covered that in lab, to the cerebral cortex, okay? So the cerebral cortex can issue motor commands. Okay? All right, so here are the parts of the cerebral nuclei. There are three groupings. You have the globus pallidus, the putamen, and then the caudate the head of the caudate, the tail, the head. Here's the head. Head of the caudate nucleus. So these three nuclei are the cerebral nuclei, right? They're in a group of three. Can you see this white track that runs down through them? That white track? So that is called the internal capsule, right? The internal capsule. It's white. What does that mean? Axons, right? Collection of axons, right? This area is very sensitive to cerebrovascular accidents. What are cerebrovascular accidents? Strokes, right? So this area suffers from strokes, right? What is a stroke? We talked about ischemic strokes, right? We're going to deny blood to the brain. So if we deny blood to this area, right? This is a really important path for motor information, right? We just stuck it in the middle of our motor, our cerebral nuclei, right? If we have a stroke here, what side of the brain is that? Right? What is that going to cause? Paralysis of the right side. Okay? Because we're denying blood to this region, which is a very important motor region. All right. So let's talk about messing up the function of cerebral nuclei. Okay? We're going to take and disrupt the function. There are two different diseases that affect the, well, actually there's more than two, but the two that we're going to talk about, right? One is Huntington's chorea and the other is Parkinson's. So Huntington's chorea, you get degeneration of the cerebral, or sorry, the degeneration of the cerebral nuclei. Chorea means a rapid jerking movement. Why would you get a rapid jerking movement if you disrupt the function of the cerebral nuclei? Because they're motor structures, right? Motor structures. Okay, so we get, the cause of Huntington's chorea is we get loss of GABAergic neurons from the cerebral nuclei and elsewhere. GABA is coupled to chloride channels. If a whole bunch of chloride ion enters the cell, what is going to happen to the resting potential of the cell? It's going to go down. Are we going to go closer to threshold or away from threshold? Away from threshold. So we're suppressing the activity. right? Away from threshold. If we lose GABAergic neurons, what is going to happen to our resting potential? It's going to go up. We're going to get closer to threshold, right? Triggering action potentials which cause chorea, right? Rapid jerking movement. Okay? Behavioral changes in dementia are also affiliated with this disease. Have you guys studied genetic diseases in other classes? This is autosomal dominance. Autosomal dominant disease. That means you have a 50% chance of getting it if your parent has it. Right? And it's really devastating. They have tests for it, but there's no cure. Parkinson's disease is another disease that affects the function of the cerebral nuclei or basal nuclei. Signs and symptoms of this disease include a lot of motor activity, right? There's something called a pill rolling tremor, mask-like facial expression. Difficulty beginning to walk. Once you get going, it's kind of okay. But motor function, right? Mask-like facial expression, you're not controlling the facial muscles, right? Pill rolling tremor, you move your fingers back and forth like you're rolling pills in your fingers, right? All motor effects, right? Here, we're losing dopaminergic neurons from the substantia nigra. If you remember the substantia nigra, told the cerebral nuclei to be less active, right? Inhibitory inputs. So we're removing that inhibitory input, making the cerebral nuclei more active. Okay? So we lose this inhibitory input to the striatum. Striatum is your cerebral nuclei and that internal capsule, that white track, resulting in excitatory outputs from the striatum. Right? More motor commands coming out. Right? Now, dopaminergic, dopamine, is not effective in treating Parkinson's. Instead, they treat it with something called L-DOPA. Right? L-DOPA is more hydrophobic. So can you think of why dopamine might not be effective in L-DOPA, which is hydrophobic? It'll definitely stay longer, but it can cross
The brain barrier.
The brain barrier. It can get into the blood-brain barrier. So you have to use something that can cross the blood-brain barrier. L-DOPA will do it. This has been converted to dopamine. Converted into dopamine. And yeah, it's harder to get rid of because it will not be excreted by the kidneys as effectively. Okay. I mentioned that we were going to kind of put cranial nerves in regions that were where we're studying. So cranial nerves associated with the cerebrum are the olfactory nerves. The olfactory nerves will cross the cribriform plate and come in synapse on the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract, we covered that in lab today. Okay, so if a patient suffers a head injury that damages her primary motor cortex, where is the motor cortex and what functions might be lost due to injury? Right? Precentral gyrus, right? And you're going to lose voluntary movement. Okay. Everyone okay with that? Conscious perception of which sense would be affected by damage to the temporal lobes?
Olfactory.
Yes. Olfactory and auditory. All right, so two. That lobe deals with that function. Those functions. Okay. So we're now moving down, right? We covered the cerebrum. We're now going down from the cerebrum. Diencephalon, integrate sensory information and motor commands. So this is a big processing or relay center, right? You've got motor commands coming out, sensory information coming in. This is a big relay, okay? So it's going to integrate this information. Third ventricle, we covered in lab. You remember that was the one that has a hole in the middle, right, for the massa intermedia. The parts that we have, thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. So the epithalamus is primarily the pineal gland, okay, pineal gland. And remember what the pineal gland does? No. Day-night cycles, diurnal cycles, sleep at night, up during the day. Pineal gland does that. It secretes a melatonin. Yeah, I think you used to be able to buy this in drugstores if you were to prevent jet lag. If you're traveling out of time, still can? Okay. But the FDA has some issues. But it will help you deal with jet lag if you're going to different time zones. It resets your time clock. Okay. Okay. So thalamus, right? So thalamus, remember the big loads? I had you hold those. That entire thing was a thalamus. You remember me having you wrap your hands around that load? Everything in their hand is a thalamus, right? Thalamus, main function, right? Main functions you want to underline, right? Filters sensory information, right? It's filtering sensory information. So a lot of that information actually doesn't get into conscious awareness, right? Filter the sensory information. It's going to serve as a relay between the basal nuclei and the cerebral cortex. What is the basal nuclei? What type of structure is this? Cerebral nuclei? Motor, right? Patterns, rhythm of movement. It's going to go to the cerebral cortex. So those two are talking. Okay? The third ventricle separates the left and right thalamic lobes. Right? Remember we had that right in the middle. We had to have that massa intermedia allowing those two to talk. Okay? So if I ask you the function of a thalamus, what would you say? Filter sensory information. Okay? So here's the diencephalon, right? See, this is going to be the thalamus, right? We've got the third ventricle separating left and right side. We've got the hypothalamus down here. Remember that was kind of like the snout in the mouth of the seahorse. Like you look at it, looks like a seahorse. This hypothalamus is also part of the diencephalon. Okay, so thalamus, right? Let's see where it's getting its information from. Okay. Okay. Input into the thalamus includes somatic sensory input. This should not be a shock based on the primary function of the thalamus, which is to filter sensory information. Right? It also gets input from the cerebral nuclei. We said that this is going to be a relay between the cerebral nuclei, the basal nuclei, and the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex. We have not talked about the cerebellum yet. Cerebellum is also a motor structure. It will get information from our precentral gyrus. What does our precentral gyrus contain? Motor cortex. Right? So here, those three are all motor structures, right? So it's collecting motor information. It's going to get optic information, right? Information about sight, be sent through the thalamus, and it gets information about sound. Okay? Now, where does sensory information go? In cortex. Which part of the cerebral cortex is sensory information sent to? Post-central gyrus. So the output, we said it filters sensory information, right? It's going to filter it and send it to the cerebral cortex. Post-central gyrus, which is your sensory cortex. And you remember when we were talking about destinations, giving people directions, right? Sensory information will end here, like the sensory cortex. Okay. Okay. So one other thing I want to make sure. So when a baby is hungry, what does the baby do?
Cries.
Cry. So we're collecting sensory information. And we're going to relay motor commands or link this to motor commands. Okay, so you see how they have to be linked, right? So sensory information is going to come in, the thalamus is going to filter some of it, but it's also going to provide that sensory information to motor structures to produce the response. It's going to link hunger to crying in a baby, right? Sensory information, motor response. Right? That type of integration. The other thing that's really important about the thalamus is that information reaches conscious level at the thalamus. Right? So if I block a pain information before the thalamus, will you be in pain? No, because it reaches conscious level at the level of the thalamus. Okay, it's got to get here before you feel it. Okay, it's got to get to the thalamus before you are aware of that sensory information. Is everyone okay with that? Okay. Okay. Now, can I erase this? Or you guys still going? We're good? Erase it? Okay. So now we're going to talk about the hypothalamus. Do you remember how tiny that hypothalamus was? You remember where the hypothalamus was? You remember what it looked like? Kind of like a little horn? Yep. All right. Look at the number of functions it has. Okay? So if you're going to guess a structure, if you don't know what the function belongs to, hypothalamus would be a good bet because it has lots and lots of different functions, and they're actually really important. Okay? So one of them is it's going to integrate visceral sensory information. Okay. Where is visceral sensory information coming from? Organs, right? That's got to be important, right? How much oxygen is in your blood? How much carbon dioxide is in your blood? What is the pH of your blood? What is your blood pressure? Right? All of that information is coming into the hypothalamus. Okay? It is going to integrate visceral motor information. So if your blood pressure is too low, you will need to change your visceral motor commands to make your blood pressure go up. Right? If you have low levels of oxygen going to the brain, what do you need to do? Right? You're going to breathe. Breathe, increase your respiratory rate, depth of respiration, right? Visceral motor. So we're going to link these two at the hypothalamus. Okay? Just like we did the somatic motor, skeletal muscle, the thalamus, right? Somatic sensory, somatic motor. We're linking visceral here. Okay? We're going to link the central nervous system to the endocrine system. What gland sits directly below the hypothalamus? Pituitary, right? So the hypothalamus will control that pituitary gland. It's going to link those two systems. We're going to take emotion and link it to changes in organ function. Okay? When you get mad, what happens to your blood pressure? It goes up. Okay? So, how do you make your blood pressure go up? What system do you have to use? Visceral motor. Right? So it's going to link emotions to organ function. When you get angry, your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, right? This hypothalamus is linking that, right? Emotional state to organ function. Control of thirst. Control that at hypothalamus. Rage and aggression. Hypothalamus. Sex drive. Okay. Thermoregulation. Controlling your temperature, right? Sending out those commands to shiver, to sweat. Okay, hypothalamus. All right, so that tiny little structure in the brain is involved in all of these activities, which is pretty amazing. Okay, you guys okay so far? All right, mesencephalon. We're now at a new region, right? The landmark is the cerebral aqueduct. Right, cerebral aqueduct, that tunnel between the third and the fourth ventricle. The structures we looked at, superior colliculi. What does superior colliculi do? Reflex response in response to what type of stimulus? Who came up with superior sight? You don't remember it. Yep. Superior sight, visual. Eyes. Right, what about auditory colliculi? Auditory. Okay. Cerebral peduncles, you remember those were our celery stalks, right? Those are just big tracts. Ascending fibers, descending fibers, motor tracts going down, sensory fibers going up. Right? Substantia nigra. Right? We've seen this one before. What did this one do? Inhibitory input to the cerebral nuclei. Inhibitory input to the cerebral nuclei. Right? What disease affects the substantia nigra? Parkinson's. The red nucleus, what is a nucleus? Collection of cell bodies, central nervous system. Red nucleus is part of a motor tract, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It's headquartered in the mesencephalon. Okay, so here's our mesencephalon. You remember our two bumps on the back side? Superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, reflex response to sight and sound. Here are cerebral peduncles, our celery stalks, ascending and descending tracts. Okay. Here is the red nucleus. Here's a little gray spot. And our cerebral aqueduct, that little channel between our third ventricle and fourth ventricle. Okay. Cranial nerves that are found in this region, cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4, the oculomotor and trochlear, or trochlea nerve. So with these, right, oculomotor, look at the name, what are we controlling? The eye, and we're controlling it with muscle, right? Motor is muscle, right? This actually does two things. It will innervate a lot of basically eye muscles that let you turn your eye left, right. You have 6 muscles that innervate the eyeball, right, controlling where it looks. This innervates 4 of the 6. It also controls pupil size, okay, so eye movement and pupil size. Trochlea makes you look down into the side, right? And we talked about the eyes being fixed and dilated. Eyes being fixed and dilated. You know that you have damage to that cranial nerve, so you know that damage occurs in this region of the brain. So it's used as a diagnostic tool. Okay. Here you can see oculomotor nerve coming in and innervating these muscles of the eye, and then this is a ganglion that controls pupil diameter. Okay? Trochlear nerve is here, innervating this muscle, one muscle that causes the eye to look down into the side. Okay? So all at the level of the eye, these 2 cranial nerves. All right, we're now down to the 4th ventricle, to the mesencephalon. Okay? And do you remember where that 4th ventricle sits? What sits in front of the 4th ventricle? What's anterior to it? We're up higher, a little higher. Do you remember the pons, ear belly, pregnant belly kind of thing? Pons in the front, what was it towards the back? Cerebellum. And that 4th ventricle is right in the center. Okay? So we've got the pons and the cerebellum, 2 structures found in this region, so we need to talk a little bit about what they do. Okay? Pons means bridge. Okay? So this is going to serve as a bridge between different regions, right? So this is going to link the cerebrum to the spinal cord, right? Thalamus to spinal cord, right? Different parts of the brain are going to be linked through this bridge, okay? So it's the connecting part is going to link the rest of the brain to the cerebellum, right, which sits posterior to it. Okay. So it's going to be the bridge. It also has respiratory function. Now we've talked about the medulla oblongata. The pons will provide input to the medulla oblongata and alter respiratory activity. So we'll talk about this in just a little bit, how this works, right? But it does carry respiratory function. Now the cerebellum is a motor structure. Okay, somatic motor structure, so skeletal muscle. Okay, so let's take a look at the pons as far as functions, right? We've got a number of different cranial nerves that are at this level, and we're going to do it in lab 2. I think for those of you who had the 8 o'clock lab, you're pretty comfortable with where these cranial nerves are and kind of what they do. So if you have not had lab yet, we will do this in lab, and it will be very straightforward, I promise you, okay? But at the level of the pons, you have cranial nerve 5, which is called the trigeminal, cranial nerve 6, cranial nerve 7, and a portion of cranial nerve 8, right? So we will cover all of these in lab as well as their functions. We've got 2 centers, an apnostic and a pneumotaxis center of the pons, right? So these are the ones that deal with respiration. Right? Apnostic center is going to promote inspiration, breathing in. Right? Pneumotaxis. Okay? This inhibits inspiration, but it does it cyclically. Right? So you breathe in, and then you stop. Right? You breathe in, and then you stop. Right? Why would you not want to breathe in continuously? Because you got to breathe out, right? So that's what this does. You breathe in, you breathe out, stop the inspiration. Okay? So again, these are going to modify commands from the medulla oblongata. Why do I know they're modifying commands from the medulla oblongata? What's the medulla oblongata? Respiratory centers, right? Have to have those working, otherwise you're going to die. Okay, so this is just showing you kind of those structures that we've covered. We talked about the pons, right? We talked about our 2 centers that will affect the medulla oblongata. The apnostic center, inspiration, the pneumotaxic center, cyclic inhibition of inspiration. We've got our 4th ventricle here. We've got our cerebellum. Okay. The cranial nerve 5 is located in this region. This is the trigeminal nerve. Right? That trigeminal nerve is it's the largest nerve that you have. Right? Largest nerve that you have. It's enormous. It innervates the face, the gums. It's involved in mastication. Okay? Face, gums, mastication. So it has a lot of different functions. and it does split into 3 branches. If you're going into dental hygiene, you will be dealing with that nerve because when you get dental procedures done, what would the subjects like to have done first? Numb, right? Numb them up, okay? So, right? You guys heard of lidocaine? Lidocaine? Do you know the function of lidocaine? Right? So if it's going to block voltage-gated sodium channels, tell me about the ability of a nerve to generate an action potential. Right? So pain, touch, do you feel anything when you have that done? No. Pain, touch, you don't feel it, right? Your face is numb. And that's because you cannot generate action potentials because you're blocking all the voltage-gated sodium channels.
What happens if somebody doesn't get numb from lidocaine?
There are some times where the anesthesia does not work, and I don't know what causes that. I do not know what causes that. I don't know if it's a regional thing or if it's the drug is not binding. Okay, that's a good question. I do not know. All right, abducens. Abducens is to look to the side, or it abducts. We talked about abducting things, right? Out to the side. We're going to abduct the eye. So you're going to look to the side, right? That's what the abducens does. So here's the abducens coming in. It will innervate the eye, right? Look to the side. Right? Facial nerve, right, is also found at the level of the pons. This facial nerve will innervate facial muscles and the lacrimal gland. We have not studied the lacrimal gland. That produces tears, okay? So when we talk about autonomic nervous system, we talk about smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, right? So we're now getting into some of the glands that we'll be looking at. So production of tears is controlled by this nerve, and it monitors taste buds, right? So this facial nerve does a lot of different things. Have you heard of a condition called Bell's palsy? Right? Paralysis of the face, right? And loss of sense of taste are 2 of the symptoms. Okay? So what cranial nerve is going to be affected by Bell's palsy? Facial nerve, right? Because you're going to paralyze facial muscles, and you're going to lose your sense of taste because you cannot figure out what those taste buds are sensing. Okay? Cranial nerve 8, the vestibular branch of cranial nerve 8 is found in this region. We talked about cranial nerve 8 in lab. For those in lab, it had 2 branches. Remember what the whole one was called? The whole cranial nerve 8? Vestibulocochlear, right? Because cranial nerve 8 deals with balance and sound. Okay? So here we've got the branch that deals with balance, affiliated with the pons. Okay. So those are the cranial nerves that you find in this region. We will do them again in lab. It will make a lot more sense when you've done it in lab too. You can see them on the models. What we have not covered is the cerebellum. And we said that the cerebellum is an important somatic motor structure. Okay? So, what I want you to do is I want you to not hit anyone first. But I want you to hold your hand out to the side, not hitting anyone. I want you to close your eyes and touch your nose. Right? If you hit it on target, that's your cerebellum. Precise, coordinated movements, fast, quick, first time. Okay? Fast, quick, first time. Okay? That is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is a learning structure. Okay? It learns. Alright, so let me give you an example. Do any of you play sports or musical instruments? Okay? The first time you sat down at whatever instrument you were trying to play, or the first time you ever tried to hit a baseball, you all sucked, right? play a piano right away? No, right? You had to learn, right? And that's the cerebellum, okay? What it does is it can actually compare what you are trying to do to what you are actually doing and make modifications to the motor command to get you closer to what you want to do. Has everyone got that? So it compares what are my goals and what are my outcomes, right? And it takes time to get the outcome to come close to what the goals are, right? And so what the cerebellum is going to do is it's going to collect somatic sensory information, visual information. Why is that going to be important? Where's the ball? Where's the bat? Right? Visual information and somatic motor information, right? So sensory information, visual information, motor information, right? We're going to compare what's happening to what you want to happen, right? Output all somatic motor parts of the brain, right? So cerebral cortex, the motor cortex, somatic motor cortex, right? Our cerebral nuclei, right? Providing input to all of that, okay? And the key with this is that the cerebellum can actually issue corrections to motor commands before any movement occurs. Now think about that. Can issue corrections to motor commands before movement occurs. Okay? So signals coming out from the precentral gyrus, right, can be modified by the cerebellum. Why would the cerebellum want to modify those commands? So you can hit the ball, right? So you can hit the ball so that you can play the piano, so that you can, and it not sound like it was when you played it the first time. Okay? So it can learn, it will correct commands in advance of any movement taking place. Okay? Everyone okay with kind of what this motor structure is capable of? It's really important, I mean, if you think about it. Would you ever want to stay playing the same instrument that the way you played it the first time you played it? Would you ever stay with that?
Does alcohol directly affect the cerebellum? When highway patrols do that hand on the
right. I'm sure it affects all parts of the brain because it's fairly it can cross the blood-brain barrier, right? And so if you're not, so your sensory perception is declined as well, right? Your response time decline. I'm not sure if it's affecting only the cerebellum or if it's kind of a combination of my sensory input is not quite right, and the cerebellum is not functioning quite correctly. But I'll look that one up. That's a good question. All right. So signs and symptoms of cerebellar dysfunction, right? So these are when your cerebellum is not working correctly, what happens? Dysmetria, right? We did the touch your nose. If you miss beyond the target, that is dysmetria. Okay? So dysmetria. Okay? Intention tremor. This is if I'm trying to pick up my keys. The closer I get to my keys, the shakier I get. Okay? Intention tremor, right? The closer I get to my target, the more I shake. Okay? Ataxia, this is the cop pulling you over and having you walk down the stripe on the side of the road, right? So ataxia is a staggering gait. You can't walk the line, right? You're going to get a breathalyzer test. And adidokokinesia, I will not ask you to ever spell that, right? This is rapidly alternating movements that you're not able to do. So we talked about supination and pronation, right? I can alternate doing that, or I can tap alternating fingers, right? If I was not able to do that, that's what this is, right? Rapidly alternating movements. Okay, so all of those things happen when the cerebellum is, or some of these things may not happen when the cerebellum is dysfunctional, when it's not working. Okay, so here is the cerebellum, right? This vermis is kind of the middle connection, connects left and right. Okay? I don't know if you've looked on the inside, but it looks like a tree. Have you ever popped those open and looked at them, they're falling off the brain, right, and the pieces? It's got all those white lines, it looks like the tree inside. You get to laughing. Trust me, it does, right? It looks like a tree, with a tree branch on the inside. Just like that, okay? This is called the arborvitae, the tree of life. Okay. So again, motor structure, hugely important. It's important because it can learn and it can correct, right? It can correct its behavior. All right. So now we are down to the bottom, the myelencephalon, right? And you remember the medulla oblongata? Remember I said it's hugely important. If it does not work, you will all die. Okay? So all communications between the spinal cord and the brain have to travel through the medulla oblongata. Right? So you remember when I said you're going to be providing directions on how to get places, right? All of those tracks will have to travel through medulla oblongata. Okay? Pyramids, it should have it in there, I'm not sure why, right? Pyramids were an important structure. Do you remember we talked about how you could not see the pyramidal decusation? This is important because a lot of motor tracks cross sides here. Not all of them, but a large portion will cross sides at the pyramid. So important that one of the motor tracks is called the pyramidal system, right? Because you have those motor tracks crossing sides at the pyramid. Okay? There are reflex centers, cardiovascular center, respiratory rhythmicity centers, right? Cardiovascular center controls heart rate and blood pressure. Respiratory rhythmicity center controls breathing, right? If these are not working, you die. Okay? What is going to modify the activity of this center? What structure? Yes, we just did that. Not the cerebral nuclei, a little further down. Starts with a P. Pons. Remember the agnostic center, the pneumotactic center, right? Inspiration, inhibiting the inspiration center cyclically. That will affect that center of the medulla oblongata. Okay? So these are vital to survival. You should be, vital to survival. You have to have those working. Okay. Couple of parts, there's a couple of nuclei. Nuclei are collections of cell bodies in the central nervous system, right? These two nuclei deal with sensory tracts, right? So when you're looking at some of that information, right, the sensory tracts will travel through here. We've got a whole bunch of cranial nerves located in this region. We've got the cochlear part of cranial nerve 8, that's the hearing, right? That's the hearing part of cranial nerve 8. 9, 10, 11, and 12. Big important one is this cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. For those of you who had lab at 8 a.m., why is the vagus nerve important? Controls vital organs, right? So it controls vital organs, right? This one is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest, okay? So this is, you've eaten Thanksgiving dinner, right? You've had half of a turkey, 4 pies, and a whole bunch of potato salad, whatever, sweet potatoes, okay? What do you do after that? Sleep, right? You curl up on the couch, you turn on the football game, and you sleep, all right? Rest and digest. So what is happening to heart rates? Goes down. Blood pressure? Down. Digestion of food? Up, right? So that is the vagus nerve. So it has to innervate the heart, the blood vessels. It also innervates the lungs. It will innervate the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, like your internal organs, right? This is controlling it. So it's one nerve, lots of branches, huge innervation, right? Huge innervation. worry about this so much, but it just does state the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus relay somatic sensory information. I think that's the only reason I put that up here. But anyway, it does relay sensory information. All right, here we can see a picture of the medulla oblongata, right? We've got the pyramid for motor tracts cross-eyed. We've got the olive, which is a motor structure. Okay? We've got the centers, our cardiovascular center, our respiratory rhythmicity center, vital to survival. We've got the two nuclei that deal with somatic sensory information. Okay? All in that tiny part of the brain. Okay? This will show you the different nerves, right? We've got the cochlear branch, that's the hearing branch of cranial nerve 8, so information about sound. Glossopharyngeal, which is cranial nerve 9, it innervates the tongue. It deals with swallowing, and it also provides sensory information from the soft palate. Here is the medulla, the vagus nerve, part of the medulla oblongata, cranial nerve 10. Autonomic nervous system, 70% of parasympathetic output. 70% of that rest and digest signal goes through that one nerve, that vagus nerve. Huge, yes.
The vagus nerve, is that when you like bear down, they say you vagal out?
Yep, that's it.
Are you like cutting it off, or what are you doing to make yourself pass out when you do it?
Right. So I think it becomes hyperactive, right? So you crush it and activate it, right? So if you are upright, right, and you activate that nerve, what happens to your blood pressure? It goes down. If it goes down so low, will you be able to pump blood to the brain? So what is going to happen? Now your heart is level with the brain, so it does not have issues pumping, right, because it's not working against gravity. Okay. My husband, I did this for my 8 a.m. class, my husband has vasovagal syncope, hyperactivity of the vagus nerve. It triggers when he gets shocked, when he's surprised. So baby crying in the middle of the night, passed out on the floor. Paramedics everywhere, the baby's in the crib, the dogs are locked in the bathroom, and my husband's passed out on the floor. And they're going, is he a marathon runner? He's got such low blood pressure. It's lovely. I'm like, no! You've got to take him away. Fix him. No, I can't do it anymore. He just passes out. He's like, just leave me here, I'll be fine. No worries. All right. We've got a couple more. Hypoglossal hypo is low, so below the tongue. It's going to innervate muscles of the tongue. And then you've got the accessory, which is going to innervate muscles of the upper back and neck, right? So we did neck muscles. You remember the sternocleidomastoid? That's the muscle in it, or that's the nerve that innervates it, controls that. Okay, so now we're down to just this bit of, remember how we said functions don't like easily fall in some areas of the brain, these higher functioning portions of the brain. And this is kind of, we're down to that. So we've got the reticular formation, right? The reticular formation. This is an anatomically ill-defined group of nuclei found throughout the brainstem. Headquartered in the mesencephalon. You remember the mesencephalon was the midbrain, right? So that was your cerebral peduncle, superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, that region, right? Why it's important? It has something called the reticular activating system, or RAS, right? And RAS deals with maintaining consciousness. When RAS is on, you are alert and aware. When RAS is off, you do not hear, you do not see, you are not collecting, you are not processing sensory information, right? So do you ever deal with kids that you can change their clothes while they're sleeping, right? Take their shoes off, take their socks off, take their shirt, right? RAS is off, right? They are not aware of that, and it's not like you're not making noise, it's not like the lights are not on, it's not like that sensory information is not coming into the brain, it's just not getting past RAS. Right? To be aware of all that sensory information, RAS has to be on.
Is there a way to turn it on?
Well, yeah,
If it's off.
You know, you can wake the baby up, but that would get in big trouble, right? So, it's going to take a loud.
I just asked my husband. I have issues with waking him up because he doesn't hear. I mean, it takes
a lot
forever
right.
to get him
going.
Oh, keep them wake up.
Right, so that's rest, that's the.
So I want to turn on and smack it or?
Yeah, that would work. That would work. All right, so, right, here's our medicine subliner, and that's where we were having the headquarters of this particular activating system, RAS, right? Sensory input, eyes, ears, right? Collecting sensory information, right? Sending it to RAS. If RAS is off, that will not go to the cortex, right? Which part of the cortex is our somatic sensory information going to be sent to? Post, right? Is it going to get there if RAS is off? No, right? It's going to block that, right? If RAS is on, the information should be flowing. Okay? You guys okay with RAS? Turned on your conscious, off. One of my children, we could run the vacuum cleaner, the dog's going to be going nuts. They don't know, right? RAS is off. Cannot do it. Okay? The next system that's kind of ill-defined is called the limbic system, right? And this is a fairly primitive part of the brain. It involves fairly primitive parts of the brain, but this is your motivational center, right? So it gives you feelings of fear, hope, anxiety, joy, pleasure, right? So anatomy and physiology is a hard class, right? Why do you do hard things? Why not do easy things? Yeah, right? You have to be motivated to do that. You have to say, okay, if I get through this class, that would give me great joy, right? I need to do this. I need to be motivated to get through this, right? And this is the center that does that, okay? It involves a number of different regions. Septum pellucidum, you remember that? There's a bit between the two lateral ventricles. Fornix, we haven't covered that if you weren't in the 8 a.m. lab. Mammillary bodies, haven't covered if you were in the 8 a.m. Hippocampus, amygdala, and the cingulate gyrus. So this is spread throughout the brain, and it is a motivational center, right? It establishes emotional states. It facilitates memory storage and retrieval, and we talked about this a little bit in lab today. But it's like of smells that remind you of things. So if I smell pumpkin pie, I'm sitting in my grandmother's house, right? All the kids got to sit on a little table, the upside with all the tall chairs. All the adults were at a different table, right? And I can remember that. My grandmother died many years ago, right? I haven't been to her house in a couple of decades. But I can remember exactly what her house looked like when I smelled pumpkin pie, right? So it is facilitating memory storage and retrieval, right? That smell reminds me of all of those memories and I can tap into them, right? Gives you drives and associates behavior, right? I will study, I will do well in A&P, I will be happy, right? Motivating, okay? So let's take a look at where these structures are located. The cingulate gyrus, okay, do you remember the corpus callosum? Right, big ear, so you can call left and right hemispheres, right? Cingulate gyrus sits above that. Gyrus was the hill, right? The sulci are the valley. Gyrus, cingulate gyrus sits right above that. The fornix sits inferior to the septum pellucidum here. The hypothalamus is also part of the limbic system. You've got this hippocampus. Hippocampus is really important for memory storage, memory retrieval. Okay. This bit right here, and we can't see that in lab. Okay. All right. So, how are you guys as far as brain? This is it for kind of brain function. You guys okay with? Okay, so let me do, let's see, let me do a couple things just to make sure you guys are all right. serves as a sensory filter. Balance. Which part of the brain is going to provide sensations of thirst?
Hypothalamus.
Right? Which part of the brain issues commands that produce voluntary motor function, voluntary movement? Precentral drivers, which contains our somatic motor cortex. Which part of the brain takes emotions and converts them to changes in organ function? So if you're angry, your heart rate goes up. Hypothalamus. Right? Which part of the brain sets heart rate and blood pressure? Medulla oblongata. Okay. Which part of the brain is the motivational center? Limbic. Which part of the brain keeps you alert and aware? Reticular activating system. When this is on, you are alert and aware. Which part of the brain deals with patterns of movement? Patterns, rhythm. Cerebral nuclei. Okay. Which part of the brain can issue corrections to motor commands? Which part of the brain modifies the respiratory rhythmicity center? Awesome. Okay. What are the 4 vessels that provide blood to the brain? Yep. Internal carotids. How many of those do you have? 2. Arteries. Okay. How do you drain blood from the brain? Internal jugulars. All right. I have been hammering this one into you. Internal capsule. Is this white or gray matter? And what
White.
is white? What does it do? Where does it sit? On the inside. That's good. Not on the outside. It's on the inside. Right? So this one sits between the cerebral nuclei. You have lots of motor tracts that go through that. Remember, we talked about this one being susceptible to stroke. That area is very susceptible to stroke. So that causes paralysis on the opposite side of the body. Okay. What about the substantia nigra? What does the substantia nigra do? It inhibits something. That's good. Something on the inside. Starts with a C. Basal, yeah. Cerebral or basal? Nuclei. Okay.
Is that related to the dopamine levels?
So low levels of dopamine. okay? So what is the disease? Parkinson's. Parkinson's. What disease is associated with the degeneration of the cerebronuclei? Huntington's chorea. How do you treat Parkinson's? L-DOPA. Why? Dopamine doesn't get across the blood-brain barrier. Awesome. Okay, you guys feeling better? A little bit? You just have to study it. Yeah. All right. So what we're going to do is I will post the videos. They're going to be short 5-minute videos. You are going to listen to the videos. You are going to take notes on the videos. You are going to fill out the packet, right? The packet. The packet has labeling pictures. Right? Label the pictures. Label the diagrams. Right? What do you know about things I hand out in class to label? It's on a test. Right? It will be on the test. Okay? So make sure that you answer the questions, go through answers, spend some time with it, right? It's just like a regular lecture class. You're going to have to listen to it. You're going to have to study it. I'm going to expect you to have done this when I get back. Okay? Can you do that for me? Can you be really nice to Anne and Lynn who are covering my last for me? All right. All right. We will leave in 5 minutes early.